Hey there guys, so today we're going to be taking a look at the Ryzen 5 7640HS, an APU that I think only recently has really started to pick up some pace in the market. It's been out for quite a long time, but it never really found a footing in the market, and it's just not until now that prices have kind of gotten ridiculous all over the board that it really finally starts to have a place. Where it really falls in line is at the above $300 price point, but below that $450 price point. And in this category where it's mostly really competing against is systems that are rocking the Ryzen 7 5825U. I'm going to say it right now, do not buy that, get this instead. I'm going to explain to you why, but first we're going to take a look at the performance that it has. The system that I'm going to be using is the Minis Form UM760 Slim, and I do have it paired with 16 gigabytes of DDR5 memory. Now I've taken a look at the system before, but I've always taken a look at it with 32 gigabytes of RAM because that's what I had laying around, and that at the time was cheap enough that realistically you could go with that option without really breaking the bank. Currently in December of 2025, that is not the case at all. RAM is so ridiculously overpriced that you're not getting a 32 gigabyte kit. In fact, good luck finding a 16 gigabyte kit. You're more than likely going to end up buying a pre-built system, you know, a already complete box mini PC, and it's going to have 16 gigabytes of RAM paired with this. And with that being the case, I want to see how this performs with 16 gigabytes of RAM across a wide variety of titles. Now, these games are going to be all over the place. All of these are just games that have built-in benchmarks. I do this just for consistency from run to run, but we're going to see how that does, and then we're going to talk about where this falls into the market today. But let's jump right on in. So first off, we're taking a look at Counter-Strike 2 running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, but we are not using FSR. And you can see with this system, it ends up scoring a very nice FPS average along with some nice 1% lows. It's not too surprising. This is one of those titles that will run pretty well on most modern systems. And when it comes to the integrated graphics, even though this is a cut down RDNA 3 iGPU, it's still able to give us a great result here, and it does do far better than Vega based iGPUs that you will sometimes find at the same price point as this system. You know, you're always presented with the option of either getting this 6-core CPU paired with this 8-core iGPU, or you could get an 8-core CPU with Vega graphics. And if gaming is your concern, well, at least here in Counter-Strike 2, you can see that going with an RDNA based iGPU does make a pretty drastic difference in Steam's most popular game. Next up is Rainbow Six Siege X running with the ultra graphic settings, and I'm using FSR 2.0 with the quality preset. I went with really aggressive graphic settings here because this is one of those titles that really seems to struggle with just the 16 gigabytes of memory that are in this system. You can get better performance if you turn things down, but really what's holding us back here is the RAM. And that's something that you're going to run into a lot of the time because of the fact that 16 gigabytes can be pretty limiting when you're sharing it between a system and an iGPU. And that's something that you are going to have to think about. You might think that, well, I could run this older title with higher graphics settings, but if the VRAM utilization ends up being too high, it can really affect how the game is going to perform for you. And Rainbow Six Siege X is one of those titles that you really have to consider turning down the graphics settings, even if it is a title that is relatively old nowadays. And up next is Marvel Rivals running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR at the performance preset. And keep in mind that this is with all the graphics settings set to their absolute lowest. The low preset still enables some of the features that are pretty demanding on here, so you do have to manually go in and set everything to its absolute lowest. And after going with such aggressive graphics settings, we're still not able to hit a 60 FPS average, and the 1% lows aren't exactly spectacular for a title like this. It's certainly doable if this is a title that you really want to play. Trust me, I grew up playing video games on worse conditions than this, but I could completely understand if you just choose to skip out on this title because the performance in this is pretty rough, especially when you compare it to the result that we were getting with Counter-Strike. Now, I also had to take a look at Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord running with the medium graphics settings. As I always say, that is pretty much what I consider to be the bare minimum, so you can get the graphical improvements of Bannerlord without having to sacrifice too much performance. And the title does run pretty well on here, though it isn't as high of a performance as I would like to see. You can boost things pretty dramatically if you drop down from medium down to low, but that really impacts the graphics a lot. But this is a title that I always love testing, but this is the title that I always love love testing because it's very interesting to see the types of systems that can run it. And considering it just had a new DLC drop, I'm sure there's quite a few people that are looking to see how a title like this performs on these relatively cheap systems. And next up is Tiny Tina's Wonderland, running with the low graphic settings and FSR is disabled. This was one of the titles that really impressed me with the result. The FPS average of 57 with 1% lows of 47 is a fantastic result for this type of title. Of course, expect those numbers to drop in really intense areas, but for the most part, this should be a very playable experience. And it does show that if you're willing to sacrifice on graphics quality, you can get very nice performance out of a system like this. It's just that you are going to run into some limitations when it comes to the raw horsepower of the iGPU, as well as the amount of VRAM that it realistically has available to it. At least if you go with a 16GB configuration, and I mean, it's 2025, let's be real, you cannot afford a 32GB kit right now. So you're likely going to have to go with 16GB of RAM, and just understand that the low or medium graphics settings are going to be your best friends in those scenarios. And in all honesty, I think it should be the case like that no matter what you have, really. I feel like systems that use integrated graphics for the most part should just try to stick to low graphic settings unless you have something that is really juiced or you're playing a very old game. I did also take a look at Batman Arkham Knight running with the high graphics settings, and this one gave us a pretty decent result with an FPS average of 49 and 1% lows of 36. If you would like to boost this performance, you can always just go with what are essentially the medium graphics settings, but for a title this old, I can understand if you just want to crank things up, and you are going to get a playable experience here, though it's just not going to be as close to 60 as I would have liked to have seen. But again, this 8-core iGPU really is still pretty cut down in comparison to the 12-core big boy that is above it. But it is nice that there is some wiggle room when it comes to adjusting the graphic settings to try to boost this level of performance. But it does also show that the age of a title doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to perform well on hardware like this. I also took a look at Ghost Recon Breakpoint running with the low graphics settings, and while this gave us a pretty decent FPS average of 53, those 1% lows of 38 were just not impressive in the slightest. And you'll see that as the benchmark goes on, there is pretty frequent stutter, and I did try this with Vulkan and DirectX 11. Neither one of them really gave me any level of impressive results. These were the best results that I can get out of it, and there was still that frequent stutter. So while on paper this does seem to be playable, it leans far more towards playable than truly being a great experience. And considering the title that it is, I really wouldn't put too much time into trying to play something like this on a system like this, but it is interesting to see the results, and it does show that games not having built-in FSR can really reveal the shortcomings of these iGPUs that can be made up for with FSR upscaling. So next up is Company of Heroes 3 running with the low graphic settings, and we are not using any kind of FSR upscaling. Overall, this is a really rock solid result. It's kind of what I was expecting to see. This title at the lowest graphic settings does look visually pretty bad, but the result is really impressive on most systems that aren't running on Vega iGPUs. And you're going to have more than an incredible time playing on here. While I haven't really sunk too much into Company of Heroes 3 yet, I'm a big fan of 2 and the original. So the fact that the third title is this playable on here does mean that it's probably going to run really well with the older titles, which is really the more exciting part for me. Now, I did also test out Shadow of War, the sequel to Shadow of Mordor, a franchise that I love so much, and it's so sad to see that it died. But this title being almost a decade old, you'd expect it to run really well on here, and for the most part, it does a pretty rock solid job, giving us an FPS average of 56 with 1% lows of 42, but this is with the low graphics settings. Really, this again shows that games that don't have FSR can end up falling behind pretty dramatically considering their age. Though again, it shouldn't be too surprising considering that it is still a cut down iGPU in comparison to the 780M. Of course, I had to take a look at the classic BioShock Infinite running at the medium graphics settings, and the result here was spectacular. This is the era of games where you're going to be able to really get some great results. I went with medium here just to make sure that it ran well, but you can turn things up to high or very high. I would recommend not going with ultra on here because the difference between high and ultra is pretty much non-existent visually, but the performance impact is pretty dramatic between the two. But I'm the type of person that plays most games at medium or high graphics settings. I never go with ultra on pretty much anything unless it's a game that's really old or just really well optimized. And while this falls within the really old category, in terms of optimization, it wasn't exactly the best in the world, but when it came out, it also wasn't the absolute worst. And I think that a lot of games nowadays really make these types of games seem like they were masterpieces when they came out out just in terms of the level of performance that you would get. Now, taking it back really old school, we have Resident Evil 5 running with the high graphics settings, and we are using 2x anti-aliasing. The result here is absolutely spectacular. With a title this old, you could expect to see some great results, but as you've seen, it's not every single case where you're playing an older title that it's going to run extremely well, but this just happens to be one of those that falls into the category of just the right age, just the right level of performance. And overall, if you're trying to work your way through the Resident Evil franchise right now, playing the older titles, you're going to have a great time with a system like this. Now, when we start to get into the more modern ones, especially the remasters, that's where you might need a little bit more of a juiced up system. But for a title like this, which is Resident Evil 5, that means there's quite a bit of the franchise that you can play up to this point. You're going to have a spectacular time with a system like this. Next up is Grid 2 running with the ultra graphics settings, and the level of performance that we get out of this is really impressive to see. Of course, it is a very old title at this point, but again, we've seen so far that doesn't necessarily mean a game is going to run really well. But racing games in general can be pretty forgiving as long as it wasn't developed by EA. Although, funnily enough, this is a franchise that is now owned by EA, though it's also pretty much dead, which, just completely tracks. A dead franchise that's owned by EA, what a surprise there. But still, this is one of those games that I loved going back to testing, and even for its age, it still looks really rock solid. And I love going back and trying out some of these older games like this for testing, because it really is funny to see how well these games perform and visually how well they look in comparison to some titles that come out today that perform really, really bad. And it can be nice to go back and look at titles that have been unblemished by what upscaling has done to modern games. Next up, I took a look at Hitman World of Assassination running with the low graphics settings. I think you're probably starting to see a pattern in this entire video that you're gonna have to go with the low graphics settings. Of course, we are also using FSR with the quality preset, and the overall performance here is really nice to see. An FPS average of 68 with 1% lows of 51 are a overall rock solid result. Of course, we did have to go with aggressively low graphics settings, but for this type of title, I would gladly play like this. And visually speaking, I don't think it really looks bad enough that I would not want to play like this. There's certain titles that when you go with the low graphics settings, it really gets aggro to the point where visually speaking, it becomes unplayable, but luckily this is not one of those titles. Now, I also took a look at Deus Ex Mankind Divided with the low graphics settings, and you will see that the level of performance here isn't exactly spectacular. This is one of those titles that, even though it's quite old at this point, it's pretty demanding even by today's standards. Now, obviously, your general desktop PC will be able to power through this thing no problem, but integrated graphics in general historically have suffered pretty dramatically in this title, and that seems to still be the case here. You do need some pretty powerful hardware to get a great result out of this, because remember, we are running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, so there's really not much wiggle room at all here outside of starting to play around with something like the lossless scaling tool. And to get that working with this is going to come with its drawbacks, because that's not upscaling natively in the game, which means things like text are going to get stretched out. They are going to get blurry. So while it is a solution, it's not the most ideal. Of course, I had to take a look at Returnal running with the low graphics settings, and we are using FSR with the performance preset. Like this, the performance is not going to be great. We know that this is one of those titles that absolutely loves to kick the ass out of any mini PC that is put in front of it. You really need to have a monster of a mini PC to get this game to perform well for you. And you can see here that the result's not great. Remember, we're using FSR with the performance preset already, and our 1% lows are in the mid-20s. Okay, that should contextualize things a bit for you there, but this really is one of those titles where if you want to be able to play it on any kind of mini PC, it's really going to come with a lot of asterisks, and most of those are just going to involve an Oculink adapter, in all honesty. I did also take a look at Black Myth Wukong running with the low graphics settings, and we are using FSR at a 66% resolution scale. This game does not have FSR presets. You pretty much just slide a scale and set it to whatever percentage resolution you want. It almost always defaults to 66%, which should be roughly around FSR performance quality. But you can see that this is not going to save this title at all. This thing is absolutely beating the living crap out of this system. Those 1% lows are not looking great. The FPS average in general is not great, and visually speaking, it's also not looking great. Of course, the game does support frame generation, but with the FPS average, and especially those 1% lows that we're getting, you're not going to want to turn that on, because if you think the stutter is bad now, wait until you're using frame generation. For frame gen, you really want things to be as consistent as possible more than anything. You don't necessarily need a super high FPS. At least from my testing, I don't feel like you need a super high FPS. What you need is very, very consistent frame rate. If you're going to be getting 45 FPS and you're going to turn on frame rate, you better be getting 1% lows that are at 40, because if not, it's really going to exaggerate the level of stutter that you're getting. I also took a look at Red Dead Redemption 2 running with the low graphic settings, and we are using FSR at the quality preset. Like this, we get an FPS average of 44 and 1% lows of 29. While it's not the best results ever, and there is some stutter that happens throughout the gameplay here and there, it's not super detrimental. And considering the type of game that it is, you're probably going to have an easier time playing with these settings at this level of performance. Sure, it's not spectacular, but again, we're talking about a single player game that is a lot slower paced, it's not as action packed, and things like cutscenes perform really well on here because there are a lot more controlled settings. And since we are using FSR at the quality preset, that does mean that there's a little bit of headroom there if you run into any scenarios where the performance is less than ideal. Now, I also took a look at Gears Tactics running with the medium graphics settings. Normally, I'll test this with Ultra, but in this case, Ultra was just not going to do it. The RAM is really the limitation there, which again, you're welcome to go with 32 gigabytes of RAM with a system like this, but at current prices, it just makes no sense whatsoever to go with. 16 barely makes any sense. The only reason that I'm really even thinking about 16 is because you're way more likely to get a system with 16 gigabytes of RAM paired with this APU than 32 gigabytes, especially in the current market right now. So things are looking pretty rough, guys. But luckily, if you can just turn down your settings, you're going to be able to get some great level of performance out of even a 16 gigabyte configuration. Now, a bit of a different test is, of course, Civilization 6 running with the AI benchmark for the Gathering Storm DLC. The AI turn time for this benchmark ended up being 31.35 seconds per turn. That's a pretty standard result with what you would expect from a Zen 4 based CPU. This is a far more CPU dependent test than anything else. And this is one of those titles where you want that turn time number to be as low as possible, because that's really how those games of Civilization end up being 8 hours. A lot of your time is spent just waiting in between the turn times. So, you know, there are some systems out there that will have turn times that are over a minute long each. You try to play any game of this on there, you're going to be on that game for probably the next 6 months. So that really is, again, one of the benefits of going with a system like this, where yes, it's less CPU cores than something like the Ryzen 7 5825U, but the iGPU is just going to be so much better, and the single core performance is going to be better for this system. And that translates to titles like this. So you can see the performance of the 7640HS. In general, I think that this is a system that is worth getting. Really, any system that has the 7640HS is going to be a better pickup than a system that has, for example, a Ryzen 7 5825U, a 5800H, or really any system that has a Vega-based iGPU. You want to be on RDNA, and preferably RDNA 3. RDNA 2 is still a better option than going with Vega, but for sure, you just want to be on RDNA. And considering that these systems sell for the same price as systems that are rocking the 5825U, there's just no reason to get those in comparison to this unless you know you're going to be using all 8 CPU cores. And I do mean that you need to know that you're going to use all of them, because if you're going to be in a scenario where you're only going to be using 4 of those cores, why the hell did you just buy that thing? I know a lot of people have it in their minds that bare minimum for any computer should be 8 cores, but in all honesty, 6 cores will get the job done for pretty much most things. Even 4 cores with hyper-threading is still very usable today. It's really just those 4-core, 4-thread systems that are starting to struggle. Of course, I would always suggest that you get more headroom than just 4 cores, 8 threads. That's just so outdated nowadays. But 6 cores, 16 threads is a great option, especially at the price point that these systems are at. I'm going to link down below a bunch of different systems, compare them to systems that have the Ryzen 7 5825U, just so you can see the price points. But I'm telling you right now, do not pick up the systems with the Ryzen 7 5825U. If you're not 100% sure that you're going to need all 8 cores, there is just no reason to go down that route. There is just no benefit whatsoever. Go with the 7640 7640HS bare minimum, and if you have the money for it, go with the 7840HS. But I'll catch you guys in the next one.